All right. Since whenever I talk about how weird JD Vance is or something that Trump did, I get complaints about, well, what about Tim Walz? Well, only one commenter has done that, but whatever. So let's go into his response following the George Floyd murder and the riots that it inspired. So let's see. Since time has no meaning and I've memory hold hit what his response was because my brain is broken. Anyway, let's get right to the article. Governor Tim Walz faced the biggest crisis of his political career when Minnesota's two largest cities erupted in protests and riots after a white Minneapolis police officer killed George Floyd. And I hope that we don't have to, I'm not going to see anything in the comments about questioning that paragraph. Because, yeah, that is what happened. You know, I do not want to see anybody claiming it was anything but what it was, which is a white police officer kneeled on his neck long enough till he was dead. There is that is a fact. Whether he had drugs in his system or not, that had nothing to do with his death. And people who claim that are just trying to make it seem like because George Floyd happens to be black and a thug that somehow his death was justified. You know, because racism. So, let's continue on. The black man's murder in 2020 sparked a nationwide reckoning over racial discrimination and police misconduct. His death and its complicated aftermath tested Walz's leadership at one of the state's most consequential moments. What the governor did or failed to do during and after the violence in Minneapolis and St. Paul drew sharp criticism from Republicans in Minnesota. Nor did it satisfy some progressives who had urged him to take bolder steps to remake policing in the state. Walz's defenders say he did an exemplary job under unprecedented circumstances. 4 years later, on the national stage as a Democratic nominee for vice president, Walz is facing similar questions and criticisms. Republicans are calling him a left-wing radical who was too slow to act, and some progressives are saying he was not radical enough in addressing police abuses. A review by the Associated Press, based on government documents, consultant reports, news accounts, video and audio recordings, as well as interviews with families, activists, lawyers, and public officials, paints a nuanced picture of how Walz handled the challenge. Of course it was nuanced, because those on the far left and the far right hate nuance. Anyway, where was I? As a relatively new governor, he tried to balance the competing pressures and interests of local and federal officials, including then-President Donald Trump, while navigating the dangers posed by fast-evolving protests and riots taking place amid a deadly global pandemic. Just as an aside, Trump did call Walz and praised him for his response. So now he's saying that what Walz did was wrong. At the time, he praised him. Sitting on the sidelines and critiquing, that's not what being a governor is. It's making the hard decisions at the time, Walz said during a gubernatorial debate in 2022. He defended how local, state, and federal authorities work together and said it should serve as a model for other states. I'm proud of Minnesota's response. I'm proud of Minnesota's first responders who were out there, from firefighters to police to the National Guard to citizens that were out there, he said. Floyd was killed on May 25, 2020, Memorial Day. Bystander video of his dying cries of "I can't breathe" spread quickly, stoking outrage. And I cannot watch that video without getting the heebie-jeebies and ugh. The protests were mostly peaceful at first, albeit with some vandalism and clashes with police, as leaders struggled to balance the free speech rights of protesters against the need to protect public safety. And as usual, there were some nefarious, bad faith actors who were infiltrating protests to make the protesters look bad, but that's a different story. Major looting started on May 27, 2 nights later. A Target store was plundered. An auto parts store and several other businesses were torched. The police chief asked the mayor to seek help from the National Guard. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey would later say the governor hesitated, an accusation that Walz would deny. Walz, a 24-year National Guard veteran, approved a limited activation on May 28th to protect firefighters and state capitol complex and declared a peacetime emergency, though he continued to leave most of the response in the hands of local authorities. The destruction only worsened that night. Protesters took control of the 3rd Precinct station, which soon caught fire and was destroyed. Guard troops did not arrive at the police station until several hours later, in the early hours of May 29th. That day, Walz criticized the abject failure of the city's response. He said the state would take control, and he imposed a nighttime curfew. "I will assume responsibility," Walz said, adding that he understood criticism that the state had not moved quickly enough. "That is on me," he said. After another night of violence between protesters and police and more arson, the governor ordered a full mobilization of the Guard. He considered a Pentagon offer to send military police, but he did not accept it. The next day, May 31st, he said Attorney General Keith Ellison, who enjoyed trust within the black community, would take over prosecution of the officers involved in Floyd's death. By the time most of the violence subsided, more than 1,500 businesses and buildings had been damaged, costing an estimated $500 million. The Republican-controlled Minnesota Senate held a series of hearings on the unrest and the official response that July. The final report in October 2020 blamed a failure of executive leadership at the state and local level and a hesitation by the Democratic governor and city leaders to confront their ideological allies. Right. It was simply because it was a KKK riot that they would come down with full force. I'm sorry, no. They didn't come down because they were ideological allies. They aren't just going after people who think like you, who you guys are the ones who, when there was an insurrection at the Capitol, acted like this was a peaceful protest, and how dare you attack us when you just let riots run amok. So, no, that's not how it works. Stop projecting. Now, could he have done better? Of course, nobody's perfect. Like I said, I'm not from Minnesota. I don't remember the ins and outs. Because, again, I don't live there, so there's no reason for me to have experienced it firsthand. But I'm not going to say that the slow response was due to ideology. I mean, if that were the case, he would have let a mob go after the officers at vigilante style. But he didn't. Why? Because it has zero to do with ideology. Governor Walz, his administration, and Mayor Frey failed to realize the seriousness of the riots and the dangers to Minnesotans if rioters were not confronted and stopped, the Senate GOP report said. Both Governor Walz and Mayor Frey failed to act in a timely manner to confront rioters with necessary force due to an ill-conceived philosophical belief that such an action would exacerbate the rioting. Maybe yes, maybe no. And like I said, a lot of those rioters were probably bad faith actors to make the protesters look bad. I'm sure that there were some who were there to protest and, got caught up in the rioting. That's a possibility too. I'm not going to say there was none of that. But to put this on ideological lines, the mayor criticized Governor Walz. If they're marching in lockstep, then he wouldn't have criticized Walz, would he? No, he would not. During recent appearances in Minnesota, Trump falsely claimed that he personally was responsible for deploying the National Guard, even though it was actually Walz who gave the mobilization orders. Wait, what? Okay. First, the Republicans are claiming that Walz done messed up the response with calling in the National Guard, and now Trump is saying that was his doing? So he's taking credit for the National Guard being deployed. But then wouldn't he be criticized for the delayed response? Trying to understand Trump hurts my brain. Every voter in Minnesota needs to know that when the violent mobs of anarchists and looters and Marxists came to burn down Minneapolis 4 years ago, remember me? I couldn't get your governor to act, the Republican presidential nominee said in July. He's supposed to call in the National Guard or the Army, and he didn't do it. Except he did. Maybe not as fast as the Minnesota Republicans wanted him to, or even the mayor, which, the Minnesota Republicans are claiming that he is just following ideological lines. But he did eventually do it. You had nothing to do with that. But then again, you claimed that that you had something to do with calling in the National Guard during the insurrection. You had nothing to do with that either. So, yes, things could have been done better. But, it's just, ugh. That contrasts sharply with the praise that Trump heaped on Walz as the dust settled on the crisis. Like I said, 2 days after Walz ordered the full National Guard mobilization, the then president told governors and administrative officials on a conference call that Minnesota's chief executive had been doing a stellar job. But of course, Trump praises people until they turn on him. And I put that in quotes because, well, he's running for the vice president, so obviously Trump doesn't like him anymore. So he has to revise his history, because you can't possibly praise an opponent, can you? Nah. Nobody can find anything to praise Trump about, so he's going to not praise anybody else. Or something. What they did in Minneapolis was incredible. They went in and dominated, and it happened immediately, Trump said, according to an audio recording of the call obtained by the AP. The audio shows that the president didn't criticize the governor at the time. Tim, you called up big numbers, and the big numbers knocked them out so fast. It was like bowling pins, Trump said. So, which is it? Was he delaying? Was he delayed in calling in the National Guard? Or did he do it immediately? Who's right here? Two nonpartisan external reviews released in March 2022 found shortcomings in both the city's and the state's responses. A report by the nonprofit Wilder Research, commissioned by the Department of Public Safety, cited a lack of clear leadership early on. The report said the state did not set up a multi-agency command center until too late, 4 days after Floyd was killed. It said the center had a chaotic beginning with no clear chain of command, while the city continued to operate its own emergency operations center with competing law enforcement strategies. The report also said the National Guard was mobilized too late. The same National Guard that Trump was praising at the time. Because he just cares about a show of force rather than whether it makes sense. A separate after-action report commissioned by the city and done by the risk management firm Hillard Heinz said Minneapolis officers who requested assistance from the Guard were unfamiliar with the process, which held up the approval and deployment of troops. Well, that's not great. All right. In the months after the riots, Walz urged sweeping changes. He called lawmakers back into a special session that July. They banned neck restraints like the kind used on Floyd and imposed a duty to intercede on officers who see a colleague using excessive force, which both make sense to me. What the hell do you think is going to happen if you kneel on someone's neck for long enough? Yeah, they're going to be strangled. They're going to die because they can't breathe. I don't see how anybody could think that anything else could happen. Even if you just do it momentarily, you could break someone's neck, depending on how much you weigh. There are reasons why you do not do that. And as for colleagues seeing other officers using excessive force, of course you should intercede. I mean, I realize that people talk about the blue wall, but seriously, what other job can you allow your coworker to break the law and not get in trouble yourself for not saying anything, even though you knew about it? I mean, there's no other crime that you can do that for. Aiding and abetting is a crime. So, how is this any different? So yeah, those both sound reasonable to me. Walz signed a modest police accountability package in 2021 that had some limits on no-knock warrants and created a police misconduct database. Later in 2021, the governor opposed a ballot measure in Minneapolis that had its roots in the Defund the Police movement. With Democrats in full control of the legislature in 2023, he signed tougher restrictions on no-knock warrants that, while short of a ban, permitted them in only very limited exceptions. Okay. A lot to unpack here. Let's see. The no-knock warrants stems from the fact that there have been cases where officers just barge in, guns a-blazing, which, considering there have been a few instances of people going to the wrong freaking residence, maybe no-knock warrants aren't that great. Let's see. Now, For those about the defund the police movement, horrible name, and I said it from the very beginning, horrible name for the movement. Because they're not defunding the police. They're just reallocating what the police do. Making sure that the police do, policing. As opposed to dealing with mental health crises where they're literally not trained to deal with. They just see a mental health crisis and they don't know how to deal with it, so they shoot them. Problem solved, but yeah, not exactly the solution anybody was looking for. Anyway, some leaders of the movement for police reform say Walz's sympathies lie with law enforcement over protesters. I'm sorry. If that were the case, don't you think he would have been a lot more heavy-handed with the protests? So, I'm not going to say that he did it perfectly, but he also understands that law enforcement has a tough job. So he has to balance these. Now, again, this is just me talking without remembering any of the specifics, or if I even knew them. Del Shay Perry called unsuccessfully for authorities to be punished after her son, Hardell Sherrill, died in what she considered a preventable death in a northern Minnesota jail in 2018 from a medical condition. The lack of accountability was one reason she took to the streets after Floyd was murdered, and she remains dissatisfied with the governor. The entire administration has failed me, Perry said. We elected them to be our voice, and you're not even going to work for us. And we promised to put you in a position, and this is what you do. You get the black vote, and then all of a sudden you're gone. That doesn't tell me what exactly Walz did or did not do. Because how is Governor Walz to be blamed for police ignoring a medical condition? Now, what he does after, that's different, but so far we don't know what he did. At least this article doesn't say. Michelle Gross, president of the Minneapolis-based Communities United Against Police Brutality, said Walz was largely unreceptive to policies that would have led to more meaningful improvements in police accountability. She pointed to stalled efforts to end a judicial doctrine known as qualified immunity, which shields police officers from liability for misconduct, and a proposal to increase the statute of limitations for police wrongful death cases. Fun fact, I believe Walz used to be a Republican, but he then realized he's more socially liberal or something. I don't know. But I'm pretty sure he used to be a Republican. I know his brother is MAGA. I do know that. And they haven't spoken in like 8 years. Anyway. Yeah, but, the whole purpose of this video is both to show that Walz is not perfect, nor did anybody claim he was perfect, and I sure as hell don't. Just because you guys think your saint Trump is perfect and can do no wrong, and that you're going to follow him off a cliff if you have to, that doesn't mean the Democrats do that. Anyway, continuing on. He's been a little too quick to kind of give the cops what they wanted, Gross said. He hasn't been as responsive to passing legislation that would actually, change policing in fundamental ways. So that's been a big frustration. Political allies, leaders such as Ellison, the state's attorney general, who won convictions of the 4 officers charged in Floyd's death, have long defended Walz's response to the riots and efforts to seek change. Now, here's another thing. If the Republicans are in charge of the Senate, what exactly do people like this woman, Michelle Gross, what does she think Walz can do? He's not a freaking dictator. If he doesn't have, if he has a divided Congress, what exactly do you think he can do? I mean, ever since Obama, the Republicans have decided that instead of actually governing, they're going to just, shit on liberals. Let's just make sure the Democrats can't get anything done, but we're not going to actually do anything ourselves. If they put the effort into governing the way they put an effort into stymieing Democrats from governing, they might actually get something accomplished and something that people might actually like. Anyway, Ellison said Walz found himself in an impossible situation during the summer of 2020, but adequately balanced the concerns of a grieving city with threats to public safety during the protests and during the long fight for reform. Somebody's loved one is killed by the police, and you can't restore that person because death is final, Ellison said. The best you can do is hold the police accountable. Ben Crump, the influential civil rights attorney who represented Floyd's family, praised Walz as a concerned and compassionate leader for a grieving community in the wake of Floyd's murder. And that should tell you a lot. That as much as did he do everything that he could? Probably not. He could have probably done more. But at the same time, if you're in a situation where you have a group of politicians working against you, there's only so much you can do. So the fact that someone like Ben Crump, who has taken over the role of Jesse Jackson of being literally everywhere there is even a sniff of a civil rights case, if he is praising Walz, then he obviously did something right. And those people who are criticizing him are either those who have had tragedy happen to them and just cannot believe that they have to put the blame on someone. They just cannot accept that things aren't as nuanced. It's somehow suddenly the governor is the only ruling politician in the state and nobody else had anything else to do with any legislation because they're grieving and they're upset. But here is someone who had every right to turn on Walz for potential civil rights violations because of his handling of the protests, and he said, oh yeah, he did a good job. So, yeah. Anyway, he used his position to advocate for passage of important police reform legislation, which stalled in many other jurisdictions, Crump said. All leaders who are bold enough to actually lead face scrutiny and criticism, with some believing they went too far and others not far enough. So yeah, he's admitting that you're going to get criticized no matter what you do. That is usually an indication that they found a necessary middle ground, which again is true because both extremes are going to be upset because they didn't get everything. That is not how governing works. They have the governor, the president, whatever, they have to be sure that they are not, in order to help one group, that they're not hurting another group. They have to ensure that everybody is treated fairly. Even if you think that the other side doesn't deserve to be treated fairly for whatever reason, That's not how governing works. And the people who are criticizing Tim Walz, like this commenter who is desperately trying to equate J.D. Vance not knowing how basic humanity works with Tim Walz, who maybe could have done more after the murder, because apparently he should have foreseen riots coming and he should have done something about it or something. I have no idea why people are bringing this up now, Republicans, as if he did a horrible job and let looters run rampant all over Minneapolis and just sat there twiddling his thumbs or something. I mean, they're so desperate that because J.D. Vance has shown himself to be a very, very weird person. Someone gives him a fist bump, he grabs it. Doesn't know how to freaking order donuts from a donut shop. Has said horrible things about race, about non-whites, about non-males. So somehow I'm supposed to dig up dirt on him because we've got to both sides this. Oh yes, J.D. Vance is a horrible excuse for a human being, so we've got to somehow show that Tim Walz is too. No, that's not how this works. This is not about balancing scales and evening it out, that one person is horrible, so the other person must be horrible. No, that's not how this works. Yes, Tim Walz could have done things better. But, at the same time, what exactly did you want him to do? I bet the people like the commenter who keeps bugging me every time I do a video criticizing J.D. Vance, I bet she doesn't even know what his response was to the riots. She probably thinks that he caused the riots single-handedly, for all I know. God knows how Fox News has pickled this person's brain and made them believe God knows what about what actually happened. Like I said, she probably even thinks that the police didn't actually kill Floyd, that he's just some drug addict who dropped dead and it just happened to be in police custody or something. God only knows what is going through that brain of theirs. It's just, but yeah, that is what I could find about what happened with Tim Walz and George Floyd's murder. So, Keith Ellison backed him up. Ben Crump backs him up. He's the guy who, if this guy was just allowing civil rights violations left and right, would have said something. But he hasn't, because he understands he was doing stuff. So, yeah, I just do not understand why this was brought up as a example of how horrible of a person Tim Walz is. Especially since this commenter is more than happy to, when pointed out that, actually I think at the time of George Floyd's murder, I'm not sure, whenever I bring it up, or I bring up another murder of a black person who dared to actually do something bad, that the general consensus, and I'm sure this person was one of them, not positive, but I think so, that they somehow deserved it simply because they were bad people. So, and now they're going to the other side and saying, oh, what about the poor people who were attacked because of riots, because of that horrible murder of George Floyd, as if they can play both freaking sides and pretend that they're not one of the racists that would have murdered George Floyd because, you know, he did something bad, so he must be killed. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble. So with that, I will see you guys in the next video.